exactly the same kind of report that you have on the self-supporting budget. Everyone has policies related to the use of restricted funds. Sometimes they're about a specific fund. Sometimes they're about a category of funds. There were a couple of reporting tools that I thought were useful, and I'll point those out before asking for your input on what you'd like to learn more about. Hawaii has a pretty clear quarterly expenditures and transfers report, but I thought the City University of New York report, it's not a report, it's a matrix. I thought, given some of the conversations that I've heard, this kind of matrix is pretty useful just in terms of showing what sources of funds can be used to pay for what kinds of expenses and what can't. And in this grid, and I'm sorry for the fine print, but in this grid, the grayed out areas are the prohibited uses of funds for a given source. So you can see that there are some categories where you can't use any funds. So no personal loans, whether it's from tax levies or indirect costs or auxiliaries or foundation funds. No political contributions, no matter where that's coming from. And then other areas where at least some form of salaries and benefits can be paid out of any of those sources of funds. Again, subject maybe to specific restrictions on what a given appropriation or grant or something like that was for. But I thought something like this might help you understand in Nevada what your different main sources of funds are and what they can and can't be used for. Maybe, again, not with these exact categories, but something along these lines. I also had some observations and thought it was worth elevating the issue of student fees, since that's an area where the policy interests are the most clear, and where, again, there's no national standard on what counts as a fee, no set of fees that every institution in every state uses. Some institutions have dozens of different fees, and unfortunately, one of my children goes to an institution. The first bill I got had 73 separate line items for different fees. It was basically the entire university budget laid out on a per student basis. And there's a certain amount of transparency to that, but mostly we just wanted to know, how big is the check we have to write. None of the fees were optional. It's unclear whether that's transparency or not. Other states have few or no fees and just have a single tuition amount and pay for everything out of that. Nevada's actually pretty low, both on tuition and fees, both in terms of the number of fees, which is maybe average, but the amount is lower than average across the country. Georgia has more fees than Nevada, but in terms of practices to consider, they did eliminate one of them last year, and that's something to think about when you're talking about affordability. One way to do it is to make sure tuition doesn't increase that much, or to reduce it. Another is to just try to contain the number of fees and the proliferation of fees, which tend to grow sometimes as a way to get around having to say that you increase tuition by 5%. So of similarly governed states, Hawaii has the simplest and lowest fees, and I'll show you a slide here in a minute on that. And I think it's worth asking whether you have any fees in Nevada that could be eliminated or combined, both for kind of a simplicity sake, for making university budget management easier, and maybe for making the bills to students a little more transparent. So in this slide, I put average tuition on the x-axis and average fees on the y-axis. And so you can see that there's not really any standard in terms of how institutions balance tuition and fees. There are some institutions, Massachusetts used to be worse than it is now. It used to have almost all fees and no tuition, and which made policy discussions there pretty confusing when you talked about tuition increases, and they'd say, well, we haven't raised tuition for years. But they're highest, of course, on the average fees. Among the states with similar governing boards, Nevada's in the lower quadrant there. Again, on both tuition and pretty low on, at least on the average amount of student fees. And this is the same slide, but with the institutions showing the Nevada institutions are in red in this slide, and they're distributed there by their tuition. The fee amounts don't vary as much as the tuition does, but you can see how the other states with similar governing boards, how their institutions are distributed as well. And I wanted to just end with an example of the tuition and fees from Hawaii Community College, where it's one of the simpler fee structures. There's a per credit tuition fee, and then there is a very small student activity and student government fee, and that's it. So that's one way that Hawaii gets to that kind of lower, slightly lower average fees than Nevada in this category. So those are just a couple of the directions that we could go with analysis of self-supporting accounts, student fees, but I wanted to understand from you all what you thought would be helpful in terms of looking at other states' practices, or which kinds of accounts and fees are of most interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson, for your input. We appreciate it. I would like to get some feedback from committee members to assist HCM in their continued review of this. But I think the issue starts with our understanding of what fees we actually charge. And it sounds like there's a whole plethora of categories of fees that we charge in Nevada. Maybe different in different institutions, I'm not sure. Is there such a list, Chris?
Chris Fatone, thank you, Chair, for the question. There's the board has a published list in the procedure and guidelines manual of all the fees, but I think that's you'd see the long list there that would probably be better served to put into some summarization for you.
I think that would be helpful, and that might be useful for HCM to study. I imagine you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. Is that right, Mr. Johnson?
I have looked at it, and yes, your fees are, in terms of the kinds of fees, they're pretty typical. There's no standard for all states, but student activity fees, I think there's a technology fee or some technology fees. There's capital improvement fees. They're called something different in each state, but yours looked pretty normal. But again, there's a range. You could have a lot more, or you could have fewer. And I'd be happy to compare them with other states if that's where you'd like the analysis to go.
So let me share this with the committee as well. The Board of Regents in September responded to the audit and indicated that they would follow the recommendations contained in the audit. That was after this committee was charged with its responsibility. And so at the time that this committee was formed, there might have been an idea that there needed to be some input from us that would help assist the regents in how to address the audit and or perhaps some of these other areas that Mr. Johnson is talking about. Quite frankly, many of the things that he has identified that might be considered are issues that seem to me to be issues that the board should be debating rather than this committee, because they're really policy questions. Since the board has decided to follow or to address the subject matters of the audit, my question to the committee is whether we need to do any more on this topic. I'm happy to explore this further if committee members have a desire to do so, but I'm not sure what we would be doing. For example, the question I posed, we get a list of fees. How are we going to make a business judgment on which fees should be eliminated and for what reason? Secondly, if we're going to change who reports on the fees or who makes the decision about how the fees are paid, I just don't see those policy decisions being recommended by the committee when we really don't have enough time to develop that information. But I'm open to your views on this. My thought was, at the time we were charged with this request, the issue about how the board would respond to the audit was still open. They've responded. I don't know that the committee needs to do more in this area. That's my thought. But I'm interested in hearing from the committee members on that point, and I'll begin with the vice chair.
Thank you, Chair Hardesty. For the record, Patty Charlton, Interim Chancellor. So I just wanted to thank you for those comments. I do believe, on behalf of the system, we appreciated the legislative audit and the recommendations that came forward. In concert and working with the board, we have shored up and made some significant improvements in our policies, and I think as time goes through, we'll be able to demonstrate those as we shore up and actually increase the level of reporting. I think my question for Mr. Johnson is, was there any specific recommendations that you saw in your analysis of how other states may be reporting the revenues and expenditures specific from those self-supporting accounts? I think that we definitely want to be as transparent and open with not just the legislature, but all of our stakeholders, and I think our recommendations on how we're going to resolve the audit will get us there. But are there specific recommendations that you found from other states of best practices on the reporting that perhaps we didn't address?
I think my only recommendation, without knowing more from you, would be that you group the accounts in more substantive ways than self-supporting accounts, and so that you can think about them in separate categories, whether that's along the lines of what is in that City University of New York matrix, where they show which funds can be used for which purposes, or some of the other states. And again, there's not one necessarily that I would suggest you follow, since they've all kind of evolved organically from each state's policy priorities. But self-supporting accounts by itself is not a very easy topic or category to kind of get your hands on and think about what the purposes of the revenues and expenditures are. So if you wanted to break it down in ways that made for more meaningful discussions, that would be my primary recommendation.
Great. Thank you so much again. For the record, Patty Charlton, Interim Chancellor. And I think we already do some of that based on different types of fees, capital improvement, for example, technology fee, those especially with restricted uses, to ensure that they are accounted for in that way. So I appreciate that. And I think I'm good on this front. Any other questions? Mr. Christensen.
Glenn Christensen, for the record. Mr. Chairman, I agree with your recommendation. One thing I would suggest is that we specifically note in our final report that we considered some of these other things, but our mission to me is pretty well defined. We've got 3 or 4 things that we're supposed to do, and I didn't necessarily see getting into this realm as part of that charge that we were given.
Mr. Christensen, if I may, would you support an idea that we looked at these topics and we pass along to the board that the board might wish to look at these topics further for policy reasons?
I think that's excellent. Yes. Thank you.
Because there's a few things in here that were I a board member, I think I'd have an interest in, like maybe grouping of accounts. How are our accounts grouped? How could they be grouped differently, maybe? Are there fees that we just historically continue to charge that maybe could be reassessed or reevaluated? But it seems like a lot of that is really board level areas, so I think Kyle had a question. Yes, Doctor.
Thank you, Kyle Dalpy, for the record. I wanted to make a couple of comments that may back up what it seems like the direction of the committee for the non-state pieces. As the committee is looking at the funding formula, that funding formula is the state funding piece, and this is, of course, the non-state. And I appreciate, as I think my colleagues, and they can nod in the audience, being able to handle some of this at the campus level. For example, if there's a $50 or less fee, we can approve that on campus. If it's over $50, it goes to our Board of Regents once a year. That requires considerable planning to implement or change a fee. Because we do vet it at the campus through our college councils, through our governance groups. At least at WNC and the other institutions, I'm sure as well, would never put forward a fee without talking to students, faculty, and staff. We use that shared governance process. So by the time it hits the Board of Regents, it is vetted pretty heavily, and we feel good about it for the non-state fees. So the assurance is at the campus level, we can do that. So I appreciate the comments and saying if the board wanted to review how to group them, look at them, talk about them. The one piece I did want to ask the consultants, which I think is actually maybe more relevant to item 6, but I will, your next presentation, but I'm going to ask it between the two. The fee discussion has a lot to do with offsetting or supporting things because there's not enough on the revenue side, which is why you're here to talk about the state revenue. And things like differential fees that we put on expensive programs are because they're not funded at a high enough level. So I wanted to note that is that in the overall discussion of the funding, there are revenue considerations that tend to drive the fees because there's a short, on the revenue side, we have to put fees in place to support it. That's one piece. The other piece is that I think you might have mentioned it, at least we talked about it in the interviews when we had them, that state funding for higher education in the state is state funding. And our system, as you mentioned a couple slides back, is unique. The other two states I've worked in, Texas and Arizona, had local county fees or district fees. And so the tiering of the tuition was in district, in state, out of state. And so there was a county assessment with a local governing board. And I know you noted that we're unique by having a state board. But when you talk into 6, I just want to put that in the background of the committee that our state allocation is the portion from the state, where other states, there would be a state allocation. Percentage-wise might be less, but there's also that local funding piece, which could actually be moved up and down, similar to like gas prices in our counties, where there could be an additional tax or a levy on a property. So that's the piece that maybe is not as consistent from Nevada to other states. Does that make sense? And again, that's a comment, not a question, but as we talk about the big picture, when there's a shortfall in revenue or we don't see as much revenue, that's where sometimes the non-state fees and things come into play.
Thank you, Nate Johnson, for the record. Well, specifically on the question of local appropriations or support, that's something that is in, I think it's less than 50% of the states have that. It's pretty common, but it's not necessarily the norm. So Nevada's fairly typical in not having local support. Although there are states that do. There are a lot of challenges with that as well, often having to do with the different levels of property tax or property, taxable property base in different communities. So I'm not sure that it's a practice I would recommend. As far as the student fees are concerned, I didn't mean to suggest that anything that the fees were being used for wasn't necessary or appropriate. It's just a question of if you have to raise $1,000 in revenue from students, do you do it by charging them $1,000 for one category and saying this is our comprehensive tuition and fee amount, or do you break it into 15 different things and say these are all of our expenses and we're going to bill you separately for each of them? But no, certainly if you would have not be able to just eliminate a fee without coming up with an alternative revenue source or incorporating it in your larger tuition charge or something like that.
Right, so I wasn't insinuating, I do have a child who I get the fee and I look through it and it's a long list. And I say, you better be using the fitness center because you're paying for it and you're not joining the other gym. And so I get that. I guess the piece on the district level funding, we're not the governance group and we're not going to change local tax rates at this. That's beyond the scope. You're off the hook on that. It's beyond the scope of your contract. But I'm curious overall, and it may not be an answer here, but is the state funding that we're receiving equitable to a state where a college may be receiving local and state funding? Or is there a shortfall on one side or the other? And again, that's not an answer that's probably right now. I'm just curious on that. And the one thing I wanted to add, Chair, I appreciate the time on this, is that the other thing on the fee balances for our institutions through our Board of Regents, we are required to keep it under 200% of what we collect. And if we don't, we have to report on that, but we spend those down because we should not be collecting fees from students unless they're being used. And sometimes that use is a 2-year plan for restoration of fitness equipment or other pieces that wouldn't be covered under state funding. And again, just comments for the committee. I appreciate it from the campus perspective. Thank you.
So I invite it. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just for the record, Regent Goodman would like to provide a comment, please.
Great.
Thank you very much, Chair. Stephanie Goodman for the record. I just wanted to share a couple of things, although, I am just a regent speaking for myself. I can't speak on behalf of the board, but I want to say that, we've taken the legislative audit very seriously and have addressed it, just to Interim Chancellor Charlton's comments. So we have taken that very seriously. With regard to reviewing, this, I think it's always a good exercise to review best practices and to just see how we can do better. And then finally, for the edification of the board, I think it's important just to note that although it was pointed out that we are unique, I think that there's some real advantage to being a system and to being able to create those pathways from the 2-year to the 4-year institution, and to, make sure that we're providing the best service for our students and for the citizens of our state. So it's just I think there's a lot of advantages of being a system and being a statewide system. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other general comments from members of the committee? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. This is Peter Reed for the record. And I actually want to come back around to what President Dalpe was discussing, because I'm just curious, when you were describing slide 11, you made a comment that's inconsistent with what I typically hear. And I would just love to know, because you said that our state funding is higher than most other states. And I'd love to know how you're defining that, how it's operationalized in this, particularly given the comments about local versus state support, and just kind of what, maybe I misheard you, or?
I was saying as a proportion of the total funding, not as in absolute terms, so I'm not sure on a per student basis, but as a proportion of your campus's total budgets, it's higher.
Okay, so we have proportionally higher funding from the state than
Right.
in most other states.
But you have relatively low tuition as well, so perhaps,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
All right. Any further comments from committee members on this topic? I have yes. Oh, excuse me. Go ahead.
Chair Hardesty, I'd like to say something.
Oh, yes. Go ahead. Go ahead, Carol.
This is Regent Del Carlo. Thank you for allowing me to Zoom in. But going back to what Regent Goodman just said, I do believe, looking at national trends, and I know that our charge was not to look into governance, that the legislature was very clear on that. But since systemness was brought up, I did share with all the regents and the presidents, and I'd like for our interim chancellor, Charlton, to pass along in our trustee magazine that we get that's put out by the Association of Governing Boards, of which we're a member. And it's one of our, say, gold standards in higher education. Back in the, I even brought it with me on my vacation here, but because it's such good reading. November, December 2023, there's an excellent article on governing and hiring for systemness, and it talks about revenue, resources, planning, and collaboration. And I don't know if our colleagues from HCM have seen that article, but it would certainly behoove them to see that in the context of what we're discussing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Combs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly see the potential for getting heavily involved in this topic area to send us down a rabbit hole that would be really time consuming and would also get into issues that are probably more appropriately handled by a Board of Regents or the committee of the Board of Regents. Early in the meeting, though, under item 3, we did request some follow-up information on both the question of the registration fee revenue being partially in state-supported accounts as opposed to non-state supported accounts, and then also having to do with the cost recovery revenue. I would feel, that information could still be useful to this body because it's at a much broader level. And I do think, the one concern I had about the audit, I'm glad the Board of Regents is accepting all the recommendations, but one of the things that audit found was that there was some money that should have reverted to the general fund in the year that did not revert because of the practices at the time. And so I do think that has some relation to the funding formula than when you're talking about state-supported versus non-state supported. And I still think that's an area that we ought to at least look at on a very high level is, how are the amount of registration fees that goes to the non-state supported accounts determined, and what's the basis for that? I mean, I think that is probably the level of detail that I would suggest we get into, and not really into anything any deeper than that.
Okay. Any other questions or suggestions from committee members? Well, I would think that on that score, Mr. Combs, HCM's input really wouldn't be needed any further, but we would get some data from Mr. Fatton on reversions or potential reversion issues that were raised in the audit and add that as part of the report. I have a question for Ms. King and then to the committee as a whole. I'm not asking for a motion today, and I don't think we've asterisked this item as an action item yet, but I would like to asterisk it as an action item in April, and that is that we have staff prepare a motion for the committee's consideration on how we would include or address this topic in our report concerning our response to the charge about self-supporting accounts. Ms. King, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Chair Linda King, for the record, and I think that that's an appropriate item for new business, and then legal can work with staff on the wording for that to make sure that we are not presenting a motion that's outside of the committee's charter, or charge, excuse me.
Okay. And I'm not asking for a vote, but is the sentiment of the committee members, does anybody object to a motion being prepared that is along the lines of what I discussed and what Mr. Christensen responded to and what Mr. Combs
Chair, I
asked about?
think that Linda King, again, I just want to caution the committee. I think that that's very close to polling.
Okay.
And we
sure
don't have
is.
we don't have an action item, and I want to keep clear of an open meeting law violation since we are the chancellor has subjected this committee to open meeting law.
You won't even take coin flips, huh? I understand. Thank you. All right,
Thank
is there
you.
any other discussion on this point? You know, it's awkward for me because the open meeting law doesn't apply to the court.
Maybe we should fix that.
So, well, give it your best. It's a separate branch of government, Assemblyman. Good luck with that. Okay. Anything else then on this topic that anybody'd like to raise, or any other suggestions along the lines that were raised by Mr. Combs? All right, thank you. I'll ask staff to work to prepare a draft motion that the committee can consider in April. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Appreciate your input. And so let's move on then to agenda item number 6. Also a weighty group of slides. We look forward to that presentation as well. Ms. Snyder, are you preparing that one or delivering that one?
It will be a team effort. We're just getting the
Oh, okay.
Correct.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, great.
I think we're all set. Great. Again, good afternoon. And for the record, Martha Snyder, partner with HCM Strategists, again, the vendor selected to support the committee on your work. Joined again by Will Carroll, director at HCM, and Nate Johnson, senior affiliate for HCM and principal for post-secondary analytics. So I'm going to start by just giving an overview of our agenda today and the work underway, and then we will each be taking different parts of today's presentation. So this here shows our agenda, the kind of slides numbers 1 through 4. Yes, I need to give you the prompt to advance it. As the chair noted, our work will be focused, our work going forward will be focused on assessing and incorporating the feedback provided from our stakeholder interviews that we have conducted. To date, we have completed 23 of our 31 interviews and have most of the others scheduled. We will also be providing and engaging on the summary and analysis of the institution's recommendations submitted to NSHE and the chair, and the other topics identified by the committee, certainly today as well as moving forward. But for purposes of today's discussion, we will be assessing Nevada's current funding formula, putting that in the context of common and best practices in state post-secondary finance, as well as looking at issues around outcomes-based funding, particularly focusing in on the performance pool, and addressing issues of innovation, which I know were a major discussion at the last meeting of this committee. And so with that, I will turn it over to Will to just put the Nevada's current funding formula in a little bit of context.
Thank you. Will Carroll, for the record. So go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, great. Okay. So we were asked to answer the questions, is the current system of allocating funding through the formula equitable and fair, and is it effective at improving student outcomes? So in thinking about those concepts, lots of ways to answer those questions. We tend to think about them in a few different ways. Go ahead and hit the next button. Oh, we'll go bullet by bullet. So first one is it aligned to state goals? Second one is it student-centered? And by that, we really mean enabling and incentivizing success of all students. And does it align with and therefore support the main drivers of costs at all institutions? Go ahead to the next slide. So in Nevada, the main driver of cost that is represented in the funding formula is cost of instruction, and particularly the student credit hour, right? It's mostly a measure of the cost of instruction, the weights accounting for variation in that cost by a different program and different level. But when the formula is built around one primary cost driver, we want to look at how that allocation sort of then look at it as at a lens through how it affects other fair and equitable characteristics of things like student needs, student characteristics, low income, adult, underrepresented minority, and of course the FTE versus headcount question, which we've heard much of from the institutions. So we pulled some data to look at how the funding is sort of allocated along those lines as another cost driver that institutions face. So this chart you will see is, this is from the IPEDS data that Nate mentioned, national level data. This is revenue per FTE, and it is the total revenue that they receive. Dollars are in the thousands here on this chart. And the far left orange part of the bar is the state appropriations and grants. This is not just funding formula. This is sort of that second concentric circle that Nate had on his slide. The next bar that you can see in the slightly darker orange is tuition and fees. And then after that, you've got a whole host of things like federal grants, private gifts, sales and services, et cetera. So we're looking at revenue. It's not an exact match for spending per student, but it is a pretty good proxy. Not all of this revenue is spent directly on students, especially at those R1. Some of it is spent on research activities. But it certainly helps illustrate, I think, the range in total resources available for institutions to spend. There's a little bit of variation in the state appropriations and grants per FTE, and there's much larger variation in the tuition and fees that is available to institutions, particularly between UNR and UNLV, and then the rest of the institutions. Go ahead to the next slide. So we did take Nevada's funding formula data and the student credit hours and the FTE and the headcount numbers provided by the state in order to look at how funding per resident FTE really breaks down. So these are Nevada residents, FTE and headcount. And you can see the variation by institution here, and the fact that the variation increases when you look at headcount and not just FTE. So at FTE, the lowest funded institution, Nevada State College at $5,800 per student or per FTE, and then the highest funded UNR at a little over $10,000. So the highest funded school per FTE receives 75% more funding than the lowest. When we look at headcount, that range, that sort of multiplier increases to 280%. So UNR's $7,500 per headcount is 280% larger than CSN's $2,600 per student. So FTE and headcount are both important drivers of cost at an institution. I think we've heard that this morning, that instruction is obviously one of the largest cost institutions, and FTE does a good job representing the instructional load for an institution and the faculty. But there are fixed costs with every student, and so those part-time students, sort of as represented by headcount here, certainly have lots of costs that come regardless of how many courses they take. Go to the next slide. So next we wanted to look at those student characteristics that we mentioned, adult, underrepresented minority, low income. And so with the national data, the federal data, again, we were able to look at institutional revenues per FTE by student population. So these are not, is not saying that the state is providing a certain amount of dollars for every underrepresented minority student or non-underrepresented minority student, but this is looking at what is the average revenue at institutions that the typical Pell student attends, what is the average revenue at an institution that a typical underrepresented minority attends. So you can see the access that they have, or the sort of additional supports that they receive, how that distributional impact varies by student characteristic. So you can see that non-underrepresented minority students have a little bit higher state appropriations and grants than underrepresented minority students, and Pell students have a slightly higher state appropriations and grants revenue than non-Pell students. And Nate, did you want to jump in?
Yes, Nate Johnson for the record. Sorry to jump in, Will. I did want to point out that the differences in this slide are actually much smaller than they are in most states. For context, there's usually a much bigger difference in funding per student when you weight it by race and income than there is in Nevada. I think that's to Nevada's credit.
Yeah, great, thank you. So go ahead to the next slide, and this takes a look at just the funding provided through the funding formula, but looks at the same sort of breakout as the typical underrepresented minority student is attending an institution that receives $3,400 in state funding formula revenue. The typical non-underrepresented minority student receives attends an institution that receives $3,600 in state funding formula revenue. Pell students actually have a higher attend institutions receiving more in funding formula revenue than non-Pell students, but I think particularly striking on this is the adult and non-adult gap. So this is largely, or this is in some part a reflection of attendance patterns, right? That adults are more likely to attend community colleges, more likely to be part-time, and so funding formula sort of reflects some of that. But I think it is important context to just think about what the distributional impact is of a formula that is pretty much entirely based on that weighted student credit hour. It can help inform discussions about things like what is needed to close attainment gaps and workforce gaps in the state, and what are some also, we've heard conversation about waiting for student characteristics in the enrollment and part-time as different recommendations that have surfaced. So I think this provides a little bit of good context for some of those discussions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nate.
Thank you, Nate Johnson, again, for the record. I was asked to provide a little bit of background about cost studies like those used to inform the weighted student credit hour calculation in the Nevada formula as well as elsewhere. So I've been working on cost studies one way or another for the last 25 years at the state level, at institution level, and as a consultant in a variety of states. But the first one was actually done in 1910, and the methodology has not changed that much. It was done by an automotive engineer who was brought in by the Carnegie Foundation, and he looked at physics departments initially. Before that point, there was no standard way of talking about quantities and costs of instruction in higher education. The goal was to quantify the amounts of instruction, and one of the things that they invented was the whole idea of the credit hour in relation to faculty time, compensation, and indirect costs. This method became more common and more popular with the availability of mainframe computing in the 1970s, and organizations like NCHEMS and MGT of America helped states create programs that would evaluate all of their programs by these common measures of costs and credit hours. They typically differentiate by level, lower, upper graduate, and by discipline like physics and business. And then these differences can be then translated as weights, as in the case Texas uses a weighted methodology. You use the weighted student credit hour by using one discipline or an average as the baseline and saying, you know, another discipline is 2 times that or 3 times that or half that amount. So here's an example from Florida that's near and dear to my heart. This is the cost study that I used to run before 2019, but the most recent example I had easily available, showing the range of discipline costs relative to business weighted as kind of the foundational one. So everything there is business is 1, everything else there is weighted relative to that. And you see kind of a range from a high over 2.5 in life sciences to a low in homeland security and law enforcement. And that's across a number of institutions in Florida. It looks a little bit different if you just do it at one institution. Currently, there are a number of states that have done cost studies in the last 10 years, including Florida, Texas, Illinois, Minnesota, the SUNY system, although I'm not sure how recently they've done theirs, and Ohio. Institutions also do these studies. The most common variant of that is the Delaware cost study. The Delaware Institutional Research Office gets some revenue for that, which presumably goes into a self-supporting account, just to connect the dots. The uses of these studies vary from information only to enrollment funding in the way that you've been using it to tuition setting to say, this program costs us more, so we're going to charge more for it. They've actually been becoming less important and de-emphasized in states as states have focused on other things, and also as the state's share of the cost of higher education has declined. It's more important to be able to account for these kinds of variations if you're paying 100% of the costs of all those variations, as opposed to when the state is a minority funder, as it has become in a lot of states. So there are a number of practical limitations to these studies, as well as conceptual limitations, which I'll go over on the next slide. They're not very well suited to our very complicated, large, modern universities as they are to simpler kinds of institutions. It's very difficult in a big research university to sort out the relationships among the different disciplines, to sort out the differences between your research and your instructional costs, because it's often faculty doing both at the same time. And graduate and undergraduate is also hard to sort out if you have graduate students who are teaching undergraduate students who are both kind of students and instructors at the same time. Those all tend to be kind of confounding practical limitations to doing these sorts of studies. Also, our discipline boundaries have been changing pretty rapidly. Interdisciplinary work is becoming more common, so the whole idea of what is biology or what is history, separated from other things, is not the same as it used to be. So those are some of the practical limitations. The conceptual limitations, which may be more important, are, first of all, that the historical costs are not necessarily the adequate or appropriate costs, that these are necessarily retrospective-looking studies, and they will just tell you what has been spent in the past, not whether that was the right amount or the necessary amount for a given discipline or level or institution. It also can't substitute for a strategy. It can't tell you which programs are more important strategically to the state or more valuable to a student or to employers. And it can't tell you who should, if there are differences among programs, it can't tell you who should pay for those differences. It doesn't necessarily have to be the state unless the state is the only one paying for the higher education costs. And I think most importantly, these studies can reproduce historical funding inequities since they are just showing you what has been spent in the past. So to use, and again, since we've been doing them since 1910, my grandparents met in college, and my grandfather was a mechanical engineer, and my grandmother was in home economics, which is now probably the College of Human Development or Family and Consumer Sciences. And I would guess at that point that those departments were funded at very different levels, and any historical evaluation of that, one serving mostly men, one serving mostly women, would probably reproduce those inequities, even today. So it's hard to tell, again, how much of that is just reproducing historical costs as opposed to what you need to pay. So you can see, just looking at higher cost programs by race and ethnicity, for example, that Black and Latino students are less likely to graduate from higher cost programs than as a proportion of the total number of degrees than others. So there are some alternatives or other ways of thinking about weights in the context of a funding formula. You can always go on an unweighted basis of whether it's student credit hours or student headcounts. That's not to say that the costs aren't different. It's just the state can kind of take the first cut and let the cost differences be an issue for the institution to balance, since every institution has some mix of higher and lower cost programs and always needs to cross-subsidize or create a balance between them, or to pass the costs along to the students. If students pay more, as they do, especially in graduate programs, which charge more for higher cost programs than lower cost programs. Increasingly, that's true with undergraduate programs as well. You can have weights based on student characteristics. It costs more to educate certain kinds of students based on their level of high school preparation or their age or other factors that can drive what it costs to educate a student, although that's not typically how we've done the cost studies. It could have been the way we did the cost studies. You can weight based on priority rather than cost. What are the disciplines or degrees or types of credentials that are most important to the state as the funder, and weight based on those? Or to the extent that the cost analysis is useful, where it tends to be most useful is where you have something specific that you want to do. So if you want more nurses, you can do a cost analysis that will help you work out what it would cost to grow a nursing program, to grow enrollments in that, or if you want more bachelor's degrees in general, or if you want more engineers. But any specific question is going to allow you to take into account all the other available revenues for that, the considerations of supply and demand and class size going forward, and come up with something more accurate than if you try to analyze all the costs for all the programs at once. In thinking about where you want to go with the weighted student credit hours, I thought it would be helpful to have some of those considerations at your fingertips.
Great. Martha Snyder for the record, and I think, building off of that, we're going to kind of drill into some of the principles of a strong post-secondary finance system, some of which are very relevant to the charge of this committee, some of which might sit outside of it, but certainly those that are relevant, I think, are things that have come up frequently in the discussions over the last two meetings, and certainly in some ways build off of where Nate just left off in terms of ways or different ways to either look at cost or to incorporate considerations moving forward. So these principles are offered, again, as framing or grounding for the work of the committee. I want to point out that these first two principles are overarching, and so not focused on the particular metrics or mechanics of a funding formula, but really establishing principles and a broader vision for higher education that can guide funding decisions as well as other policy priorities. So these two include clearly established goals and objectives for higher education that are commonly understood across stakeholders. These could include goals and often include goals around attainment, closing gaps in access and outcomes for different student groups, and then certainly increasingly aligning to and supporting the state's workforce and economic needs, as well as enhancing institutional missions. States are using these goals increasingly not only to guide the particular elements of a funding formula, which is the primary focus of this committee, but also to inform some level of state commitment to funding higher education. So as you can see here, Nevada falls short on these two framing principles. And while the state had an attainment goal, it did expire in 2020. And we know that the new higher education specific goal and strategic plan have not been fully formalized, though certainly there are some principles advanced by the governor. I do want to note that through our interviews, we are asking, for those who have been exposed to the interviews, one of our opening questions is trying to understand your perspective on what the priorities are for higher education. But obviously, it's not the same as kind of a broader, more cohesive process. Additionally, the current funding model is most of all an allocation model, so it does inform the request, but ultimately is used to allocate whatever resources are appropriated, not defining necessarily a specific level of funding. And again, while these concepts have been raised in several of our interviews, it's important to note the scope of this work is really focused on the funding formula itself, how to allocate state resources, and will not appropriately address these issues, certainly given the time that we have and certainly the framing of this particular committee. I won't spend time on this slide, but just for reference, these are two very recent state examples of states that have taken a very comprehensive approach and review to their funding formulas. One in the case of Texas, looking at community colleges. In the case of Illinois, looking at universities and establishing much more comprehensive approaches for funding those two sectors in those particular states. Again, I won't spend time on this, but just for references moving forward. So these following principles are really much more relevant to the charge of this committee, really looking at addressing the components or mechanics and the metrics of a funding formula that can be used to inform the allocation of state funding. So I'll definitely spend more time on each of these, then we drill into more specifics of Nevada's current funding model and some considerations for moving forward. So first and foremost is a funding system that includes a minimum level of funding support or fixed costs to support fixed costs. Oftentimes, the state approaches are some sort of guaranteed minimum for O&M, that's operations and maintenance. And sometimes this is adjusted for the size of the school. We did hear issues come up today around the current way that Nevada includes this kind of minimum support, primarily through the small school adjustment. Based on the student credit hours to ensure a minimum level of funding. And we'll discuss in just a little bit some potential considerations for that. There's also the research, operations, and maintenance adjustment for the R1 institutions. That can be considered both an operations and maintenance adjustment as well as a reflection of mission. Also a funding system that is responsive to changes in the system on both enrollments and outcomes. Funding based on combination of enrollments and outcomes. We have seen increasingly states shift from FTE only to include and reflect considerations for headcount. The current Nevada funding model, as you know, is heavily based on weighted student credit hours. These are tied to enrollment. And the construct of the outcomes-based funding or the performance pool is overall not responsive to changes. Again, as has been noted, there are certain institutions that achieve above 100% of their targets, and the funding model does not take those factors into consideration. Two other principles, a funding system that aligns with the state's current needs for a more educated and trained workforce. We oftentimes see this most frequently see this reflected in some measure of the outcomes that are considered in funding models, having a priority for specific in-demand degrees or certificates. We do know that data can be a limiting factor for much more direct workforce metrics. States are trying to get increasingly targeted on job placement metrics, return on investment, but data are oftentimes a limiting factor there. The Nevada model currently includes the economic development degrees as a metric within the performance portion of the funding pool. But again, and we will get into much more specifics on the performance funding pool, but it does perhaps check the box at least as a component of the performance pool. And then a funding system that accounts for differing student needs. Again, this has been a discussion across our last two meetings. Typically a feature that states have in their outcomes or student success metrics. This is where we first saw these types of these types of metrics accounted for were in states that included outcomes in their funding models. And increasingly, we're seeing states integrate these into adequacy and enrollment components, again, to reflect much of the conversation that has happened over the past two needs, the reaction or the reflection that these students require kind of upfront supports that should be accounted for as students are entering institutions. Nevada, again, does not include any sort of adjustment for student need on the front end of its funding model, particularly in the weighted student credit hours, though it does include completions by URM and Pell students in the performance pool. Just to kind of summarize in terms of what we are seeing in states, states are increasingly using a combination of funding formulas that really balance these various considerations of access and outcomes and student and economic needs. Increasingly, these approaches are being adjusted to reflect needs, including some sort of adjustment either to the base or weighted enrollment, as well as on the outcome side. And then certainly states are including or supplementing certain mission-specific aspects. There are ways states are doing that within the funding formula, but certain aspects of that are oftentimes considered outside of the funding formula, such as medical schools and research. This is really just an illustration of the last slide, really breaking it down into a best practice or a growing trend, how states are taking this more balanced approach, core costs, operations, and maintenance. Sometimes there are adjustments within those components to reflect school size, to reflect different types of students being enrolled. Certainly adjustments for students on both enrollment, headcount, and FTE, progression and outcome metrics, and then some level of mission differentiation. Breaking down each of the components of Nevada's current funding model, looking at the core costs, we consider this as partially included. There are pre-formula adjustments, as they are referred to in the funding formula itself. This includes the small institution factor set aside, as has been noted, adjusted to account for efficiencies of scale related to fixed costs. This has not been revisited in terms of that $30 per weighted student credit hour for each weighted student credit hour below $100,000. This does ensure a minimum funding level of $3 million per college when you do the math. But again, it has been something that has not been considered or revisited. And then there is the research, operations, and maintenance set aside. Again, this could be considered a mission-specific adjustment, but is also an operations and maintenance set aside that supports the cost for research space at UNLV and UNR specifically, and has a calculation there of basically funding research that generates about $180 to $310 per FTE. Looking at enrollment, this is included, or at least partially included, in the student weighted credit hour completions. We do consider that at least a partial enrollment factor. It does include only Nevada resident students, and I do know that there was some discussion in the last meeting about whether or not this provides a disincentive for enrolling out-of-state students. I do want to kind of bring into consideration one, that state revenue is not the only source of funding or the only source of incentives for enrolling out-of-state students. And oftentimes, as in the cases in Nevada, out-of-state tuition is higher and certainly provides its own incentive. So the limitation of directing state support only to in-state residents, is actually a very common practice across states. And while there could be desires for state to support the enrollment of out-of-state students, if done, we would recommend that some consideration of higher tuition that these students pay be factored into that consideration. The weighted student enrollment, the current funding formula includes adjustment for cost based on discipline and academic level, certainly reflecting back on the presentation or the set of slides that Nate just walked through. This supports institutions with higher costs and higher level disciplines and program mix. And these cost adjustments, however, may or may not be aligned to state economic and workforce needs. Again, referencing Nate's slides, they're a reflection of historical costs, not necessarily strategically derived based on what the state needs from its economy or workforce. The costs for adjustments for disciplines and academic level are institution-centered cost adjustments, but certainly there are also student-centered costs that we consider to be absent from the current funding approach, and again, has been a frequent theme of many of the presentations you've already heard. This is something, or the rationale that for including this or considering this being included is that these colleges that serve higher numbers and proportions of students from underserved backgrounds have higher costs associated with the supports needed to retain and graduate these students. There's a couple of different ways that this could be included. It could be included either on this weighted student credit hour adjustment here or considered a mission aspect or a mission adjustment, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Again, we will get into much more detailed specifics on the mechanics of the performance pool, but this is really just simply an assessment of the metrics that are included and how they align to the principles that we earlier lined out for components of a strong funding model. Looking at the outcomes and the weighted outcomes, Nevada's metrics include both of these, includes both the set of outcomes that are consistent across all institutions, but also some differentiation. And also includes the 40% premium for completions of Pell and underrepresented minority students. Again, not speaking to the mechanics of the performance pool, simply speaking to the metrics that are reflected within. And then finally, at least in terms of kind of assessing specifically Nevada's current funding formula, discussion around mission differentiation. There's certainly a few components intended to address mission, or at least could be considered to address mission. This includes the earlier referenced O&M adjustments for research, the mission related to student credit hour weightings that favor institutions with master's and doctoral programs, as well as specific components of the performance pool that include specific metrics as well as specific adjustments or specific weightings across those metrics. Again, it could be argued or could be considered to include some other mission metrics that maybe are better addressed through already discussed areas. So rather than specifically adding mission differentiation in terms of additional metrics, perhaps accounting for the enrollment of part-time students, including summer enrollments and adjustments to account for the costs of supporting needs from underserved programs, which certainly are central to the mission of all institutions, but particularly community colleges and Nevada State University. This provides a comparison across a handful of states, of selected states, and we'll get into the rationale for the states that we've selected throughout this presentation in just a moment. But it does show you some comparability. Here, we specifically selected states that have one formula for all of its institutions. So we look at Nevada in comparison to Louisiana, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Colorado. O&M, again, the small school and research adjustment. Louisiana includes an adjustment for square footage. Minnesota has some sort of facilities, operations, and maintenance adjustment, and New Mexico and Colorado don't even consider operations and maintenance. Enrollment, the student credit hour is a pretty common feature. FTE and headcount is used in Minnesota as well as Colorado. There are weighted enrollment costs reflected in Nevada and Louisiana, and student-centered weights considered in Louisiana, Minnesota, and Colorado. Outcomes are pretty consistent. Again, not necessarily the mechanics of how those outcomes and the metrics of the outcomes are used, but the types of components are the types of metrics that are reflected as are weighted outcomes within each of these funding models, with the exception of Colorado. And mission, again, is a commonly reflected or commonly incorporated feature of each of these funding models, done in a variety of different ways. Just a note about how we selected the states that were used for comparison, both on that previous slide as well as the list that we will be using going forward. We looked at states that have comparable attributes to Nevada, including low tuition, as was referenced in the earlier presentation, low state funding per student, and I know it was just to put it in context, reflecting on an earlier discussion. By selecting these comparison states, Nevada is actually number 33 in state total funding per FTE. Each of these states that are selected are within that range, I believe with the exception of New Mexico, which has a higher overall state funding per FTE. We also ensure that there's kind of a low student share of total cost. We ensure that there is one formula for both the 4-year and 2-year sectors, or at least many of the states that we use as comparison do have only one formula that directs resources to both 4-year and 2-year sectors. And then importantly, states that have seen enrollment growth over the past decade. This shows the selected list of states, again, some of those referenced on earlier slides. But one of the areas
Snyder, may I interrupt you?
Yes.
There's a lot of slides and a lot
Sure.
of information, but could you go back to the last slide?
Yes.
Are there states that separate the formula between 4-year and 2-year institutions? And what is your view about considering that approach here?
So there are states that separate 4-year and 2-year. Most of those states have a much higher, a much more significant number of institutions than what Nevada has. So that is one factor. Also, I don't know if I have a strong opinion in terms of that consideration. I think there's other ways to address mission differentiation and consideration within the existing funding formula without separating it out into two separate funding formulas. And I think many of the recommendations that have been put forward can be done without the need for two separate funding formulas. But many of the states that have separate funding formulas have very different governance systems, number one, and number two, have a significant higher number of institutions than what Nevada has.
I would just like to footnote, speaking for me and from what I sense are areas of inquiry about attributes that we would consider. I'd like to at least footnote the comparisons of states that use different funding formulas for 2-year versus 4-year. Maybe I'm confusing this, but I think the attributes could be and are different, and how that might influence the formula is of interest to me. Thank you.
So here we do show, right, that one of the kind of most consistent factors is one funding formula for both sectors. Oregon and Montana do have, well, actually, I think Montana has one formula. Sorry, there's a typo on this slide. We'll make sure that we get corrected. Slides around Oregon in the consideration for the comparison states that we selected is the only state among this group that has a separate formula for its 4-year and 2-year institutions. Though certainly we can bring others to the table. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Will to dive into the performance pool and put that in context of other state practices.
Great. Thank you. Will Carroll, for the record. So yeah, I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time for our presentation digging into outcomes-based funding and the performance pool in particular. It's sort of broken into 3 phases. The first is looking through HCM's typology of outcomes-based funding formulas. So what are the principles of a quality outcomes-based funding model? And we'll look at Nevada and some of the comparison states and how they stack up to those principles. The second phase will be looking through Nevada's metrics in particular that are in the performance pool and whether they align with state priorities and lead to an equitable and fair allocation of funds, and also how they compare to the other comparison states and the metrics they use and the ways that they weight them. And then finally, we'll look at whether the structure, the sort of the way that the performance pool operates incentivizes performance, and the 3 bullets here we'll get into in more detail later, but they're essentially pieces of the HCM typology of a strong outcomes-based funding formula that are sort of tied to a strong incentive for improved performance. So we will dive into this is a sort of screenshot from the typology, which was published in 2020, so it was sort of probably evaluated for Nevada in 2019. In that evaluation, HCM's typology sort of considered the weighted student credit hour as part of the outcomes-based funding formula because it does look at the completion of the courses and not just the enrollment in the courses. For today's discussion, I want to differentiate that from talking about just the performance pool itself because it does change a little bit of the assessment. So as you can see in that initial evaluation, Nevada was considered a type 4 or the highest level of outcomes-based funding formula. If we consider just the performance pool, 2 things change in this chart. One is the funding level. So the funding level for the assessment of the typology, the threshold for a high level of funding was 25%. As we know, the performance pool is a 20% carve out from the allocation, so that would be more in the moderate range. And the second thing that would change would be this last row, the formula-driven or target recapture. So a formula-driven approach to an outcomes-based funding essentially means that it works in the way that the weighted student credit hour does right now, which is that there's a formula to sort of allocate the dollars out that all institutions are sort of competing for or factored into. The target recapture approach is much more like how the institution-specific performance pools work in Nevada right now, in that each institution has its own pool of funds that it is competing for, and its performance on that does not impact the other institutions' ability to receive their funds from their performance pool. So those are the 2 things that would change, the funding level and the formula-driven or target recapture. With those changes, I think we haven't discussed this formally, but it's sort of like, it would sort of fall into the type 3 OBF if we were just looking at the performance pool itself because of those two changes. All the other things reflecting institutional mission, including total degrees, credential completion, underrepresented student success prioritized, and in implementing for multiple years would still be true of the performance pool as well. Let's go to the next slide. So 31 states are implementing an outcomes-based funding formula right now in at least one sector. I think we shared some of these maps in our first presentation, but just wanted to refamiliarize everybody. It's 31 states in the 2-year sector, 27 in the 4-year sector. About a quarter of outcomes-based funding formulas are in that type 4 category of our typology. And then next slide, we looked at the comparison states that we selected and how they hit on these various principles of a strong outcomes-based funding formula. So the first principle that we have is whether it's linked to an attainment goal. And every state that we have in the comparison, pretty much most of the states in the typology are linked to an attainment goal, meaning that they're trying to reach they're trying to incentivize institutions to produce more graduates, reach that attainment goal. The next principle is base recurring or new funding. And base recurring, what we mean there is that it is funding that will be coming from the base every year. It will not be required to see an increase in state funding in order for any funding to go through the performance pool. Oklahoma is the only state here that relies on new funding to sort of fund its performance-based funding. That's one reason why on the far right column there, the funding level, you see that their funding level for their outcomes-based funding is low, because every year that they sort of that they have been cutting higher education more often in the past years than they have been increasing it. And so there's been very little put into performance-based funding in Oklahoma. In the most recent year, it was about a 2% increase. Most of the rest of the states in this group are in that 5 to 10% range. There are a couple that are all the way up at 50%, 90%, even 100% that they allocate through their OBF. So the next slide looks at a few of the other principles in the typology. The first one being reflect institutional mission. So for this, Colorado and Oklahoma are the only states that don't reflect institutional mission in some way in their outcomes-based funding. Typically, the way that the typology assessed this was whether there are weights by degree type or metrics for research or some other approach to differentiating across types of institutions and their missions. This looks at whether the OBF has varying weights, scales, or metrics. We've heard a lot today about how the current funding formula may not appropriately differentiate based on mission. It's sort of just, I think this gets at the point that there are metrics and ways that the formula does get at it. Whether it does it appropriately or sufficiently, I think, is a question that the committee would want to grapple with based on the input we've heard. The next couple metrics or principles are represented in every comparison state. They're pretty essential to having a strong outcomes-based funding. The first one being including total degree or credential completion, and just a metric measuring whether there are, the number of degrees produced. The second one being underrepresented student success prioritized. That sometimes shows up in separate metrics for degrees awarded to underrepresented populations. Sometimes it's weights assigned to those degrees that are earned by those populations. And then finally, implementing for 2 or more years. Just wanted to, the part of the typology assessment was, does the state show a sort of sustained commitment to performance funding over time? And every state, except for one of the Oregon sectors, has been implementing performance-based funding or outcomes-based funding for a relatively long period of time. This last column on institutional allocation method is one that we'll dig into a little bit later, but there are sort of 3 variations of this. The first is institution-specific pool, which you all are familiar with as the way that the performance pool currently works. There's a set amount that is allocated to, or sort of for each institution, and hitting targets helps them access those funds from that pool. Relative growth is an approach where it sort of is looking at how much an institution has improved its own metrics and comparing that growth to other institutions' growth over their own baselines. Whereas the share of outcomes is not the growth of your own institution, but just the number of outputs you have produced as a share of the entire state's output. So 10% of degrees produced, you get 10% of the funds for that, essentially. So, but again, we'll dig into a little bit more of that as we go through. So that's the sort of phase one of this, of looking at the principles of a strong outcomes-based funding formula. We'll go to the next slide, where we start to turn to looking at how Nevada's performance pools advance state priorities and the metrics that they use to do that. You can go ahead and add that next table in there. Thank you. So, we looked at first thing is that the metrics should be advancing state priorities, as Martha alluded to, without a sort of a set strategic plan or set of goals or priorities. We sort of relied on some of the themes that we heard during interviews and some of the conversation from the February meeting to identify things that have jumped out as key priorities around increasing and getting more equitable attainment, preparing a workforce to attract new industries and meet the current demand, and then also creating affordable pathways for students. So a lot of emphasis on that transfer. You can see that in the box on the right there, degrees completed makes up between 40 and 50% of the performance pool metrics. And then that economic development degrees makes up 20%. So that really aligns with that second priority there. And finally, transfer makes up 5 to 10%, depending on the institution of the metrics. So that it seemed to be a pretty big priority. It's a somewhat small portion of the performance pool. Could be something that, if the committee was interested in emphasizing further, that percentage could be discussed. Go to the next slide. Yep. So then we wanted to look at sort of the way that the formula, the metrics are used to ensure equitable and fair allocation. And for this, we looked at, just the making sure that the metrics promote the success of traditionally underrepresented students. This is a really important thing to do, just given the possibility of perverse incentives that research has found without good equity weights, that performance-based funding can create bad incentives to restrict access to populations that have traditionally not had as strong outcomes in higher education or are believed to have worse outcomes. So the weight for a 40% weight for the degrees earned by Pell and underrepresented minority certainly does that on the outcome side. Martha alluded to the fact that there's not anything on the front end for the enrollment of those students, but it does do so on the outcome-based side. Go ahead to the next slide. So this table is another snapshot from the typology. I won't spend much time here, but it's basically just the driving home the fact that total degrees and certificates completed is the most common metric used in outcomes-based funding formulas. The other common ones are weights for priority fields, for priority student populations, and for efficiency, and Nevada checks all those boxes with the different metrics that it uses. In this next section, we're going to go through some of the common buckets of OBF metrics and look at sort of the national trends, the comparison state examples, and then Nevada. And hopefully this will be useful to you all as you think about if there are any changes you want to make to the metrics within the performance pool. But so on progression, these metrics we see in half of all four-year OBF models and 3/4 of the two-year sector models. They are commonly, the most common metrics are those that you see in the comparison state example box here. So students that are reaching 15 credits earned, 30 credits earned. These are benchmarks that are research-based, that are associated with students that hit those benchmarks are more likely to graduate. We also see retention rate and gateway course success. And these metrics typically make up between 10 and 30% of states' outcomes-based funding. In Nevada, the progression metrics are gateway course completions for the 2 years and transfer from a 2-year, as we consider it as a progression metric for the 4 years. So this is a lower area of emphasis for Nevada compared to some of the other states that we see. There's less emphasis on the progression. So again, something that you all could decide to dig into further as if there was a desire to put more emphasis on the progression side. Next slide. So on completion, these are used pretty much universally in outcomes-based funding formulas. The comparison states, the metrics that are used are degrees awarded, graduation rate, transfer to a four-year institution, on-time completion, and these typically make up between 1/3 and 2/3 of states' outcomes-based funding formulas. Nevada has a stronger emphasis on completion than most other states, with a total close to 70% in terms of the amount of the performance pools that are dedicated to completion metrics. So you have the credentials awarded, the transfer, and you also have an efficiency metric around degrees per 100 FTE. So post-completion metrics are next, and these are focused on things like job placement, earnings after completion, and degrees earned in high-demand fields. So we're seeing a lot more interest in some of these wage and employment-related outcomes in states, especially as more states are linking up with workforce data systems and their departments of labor or federal data sets. The holdback on a lot of that, I think, has been from data availability, but that is improving. But typically, most states are using a more common approach that we see in those comparison states, which are weights for degrees in those high-demand, high-wage fields. And there are kind of two ways that states do this. One is like a data-driven approach that you have a workforce board in the state that has identified, areas of workforce demand and areas of high-wage jobs. Another is sort of, I think, how Nevada has approached the economic demand degrees, which are, STEM and health and a couple state priority areas. And these weights, so some states use separate metrics for this. Some states use weights assigned to their credential production. Nevada is pretty much right in the ballpark of that 20% for those economic development degrees awarded. Let's go to the next slide. So priority population weights. Again, this is a very common practice in outcomes-based funding models. Over 3/4 of models use a metric or a weight to support the success of underrepresented student populations. Most of the time, that weight is assigned to the completion of a degree. There are a couple of the comparison states we looked at that assign the weight to retention as well. And the most common populations that are assigned these weights are Pell students, underrepresented minority, adults, academically prepared, and there are actually a couple states that use veterans as well in their weighting. And the weights can range anywhere from 5 to 50%. So again, Nevada is kind of on the higher end of that scale with a 40% weight for Pell students and underrepresented minorities. All right, so this is kind of moving on to the third phase of discussing the extent to which Nevada's structure of its performance pools effectively incentivizes outcomes. And the HCM typology for outcomes-based funding emphasizes 3 principles for this. So the first is that it should be recurring and not just used to allocate new money. If you only allocate it through new funds, too often there are years where it won't come into play at all, and there will be years when outcomes don't sort of factor into it. The second is that it needs to be large enough to influence institutional behavior, and sort of we think of the minimum threshold for that as 5%. The final one is that it should reward continuous improvement and should not cap rewards at a certain goal or threshold, which we've heard a lot about in discussions from the institutions. So the next slide just sort of looks at this for Nevada. You can see that Nevada's is recurring. It is a large allocation of funds, but it does not have that sort of continuous improvement incentive built in. Most of these are pretty common in states, anywhere, most of the time it's about 2/3 of states check the boxes for these principles. When it comes to the continuous improvement one, it's actually very common in the 2-year sector. 27 out of 31 states have a design of their funding formula that does reward every additional degree produced, every additional student retained, that sort of thing. So, all right, so let's go to the next slide. So we sort of described 4 different challenges for Nevada's current performance pool with regards to this issue of continuously incentivizing improved outcomes. The first of which is this carve-out structure. it really limits the maximum benefit to an institution, especially a low enrollment institution, because it is defined by the amount of weighted student credit hours. It's always going to be a proportion of that. And so a highly successful small institution will only ever receive the maximum funding allowed by its weighted student credit hour, which will be capped by that size. So, even one that graduates 100% of its students is still sort of limited by enrolling only 1,000 or 2,000 students. Second challenge, the earn-back nature of the performance pool it may not seem to drive very much behavior among institutions. In our discussions and listening to the presentation so far, it appears to be more a source of frustration than any particular effective carrot or stick for institutional behavior. So that's more of a qualitative assessment, but I think an important one to consider. Third, it is structured so that institutions do not get anything additional for that additional degree produced above their target. The final thing is that the targets aren't rebaselined, so that this could create, Nevada's sort of in an exceptional position in that its enrollment growth over the past decade or so has really, I think, prevented this becoming an issue. But had any Nevada institutions experienced some of the declines in enrollment over the past decade that we've seen in many other states, that lower baseline of students, while the expected production of outcomes continues to increase, could create this sort of almost death spiral of you miss your targets because your enrollment has dropped. You therefore have less revenue to be able to invest in your students and to improve those outcomes, or to recruit, retain, and graduate students. So the next slide just illustrates this a little bit. So the first phase here, go ahead and click one. This is just a hypothetical, the blue line is a hypothetical weighted point target, which increases at 2% every year. And the orange line is sort of a hypothetical actual points earned by an institution. So in that first phase, they're improving their weighted points by 3% every year, which might be producing more outcomes. It might also be enrolling students. And then COVID hits in phase two. Go ahead and click that one. And then enrollment drops. The drop, if performance stays consistent while enrollment drops, that institution will eventually fall below the target, right? Until it changes its enrollment baseline or its performance. There may be a lag because so many of the performance metrics are focused on completions. But eventually, if performance stays the same, that institution will be at a point where its actual points are well below its target. So then in phase three, what we've illustrated here is even if this institution manages to reach for a 4% improvement rate, which is better than it was doing before its enrollment drop, it is still under that target and therefore losing some of its funding. So this is an institution that is doing something exceptional at 4% increase compared to what they were doing before, and they're still sort of not hitting their target under the performance pool. Just that sort of leads to them having less resources, probably making it harder for them to continue that 4% improvement over time. So we wanted to put forward in the next couple slides some possible alternative ways that Nevada could structure its performance pool to address some of these issues. So the first would be to shift to this share of outcomes approach. As noted earlier, this is sort of where a designated amount of funding is put out, and institutions divide that based on the share of their total outcomes generated in the state. This could be done by metric, so 10% of the 10% of the transfer students, 10% of the degrees completed, 10% of the economic, or you can divide the pools by the metrics themselves, or it can be done as an entirety. But this does absolutely reward improvement beyond 100%. And also it does create more competition between institutions, which we sort of listed as a con here because we have heard from a number of institutions about the sort of concern of creating that direct competition. I think some does help incentivize behavior, but it also, I think, is a concern for many stakeholders. We just wanted to note that half the comparison states that we looked at use this approach to allocating their OBF funding. So it is probably the most common of approaches in allocating funds. The second one is the relative growth model. And this is where institutions that improve more than others get a larger share of the funds. So the example here is that institution A improves its weighted points by 10%. The other institutions improve it by 0 to 5%. Therefore, institution A is going to receive a larger share of the performance pool than it did in the previous year. There are lots of ways to structure this, and I didn't want to get too into the details because they get pretty wonky, but we can certainly, the idea is to put some of these options on the table, see what resonates. We can come back with more ideas, more details later. So this, again, does reward improvement beyond 100%, and it sort of creates indirect competition in that you are competing against your own baseline. So it is specific to your metrics, but it is also sort of how well you are doing compared to the other institutions that ultimately directs your funding. So on the next slide, we wanted to illustrate the fact that if you take these approaches, our recommendation, excuse me, would be sort of setting aside performance pool funds before allocating the weighted student credit hour. Mouth is drying out, excuse me. So this is just an example of from FY20, the appropriated amount. You've got your set asides already for small institution factor and O&M. And you would take aside the 20% for the performance pool ahead of time to implement the share of outcomes or relative growth model. Excuse me. So the idea here is that in order to ensure that it maintains its sort of structure as a base recurring funding pot, which is one of the key principles for OBF, that it would be taken out before allocated, and not sort of on top of it at the end. So, sorry. Go ahead to the next slide. So if the committee wanted to stick with the current concept, sort of current structure of the performance pool, we would recommend two sort of possible approaches to address some of the challenges. The first would be rebaselining those individual targets so that they are sort of setting reasonable but ambitious levels of improvement for institutions. This, prevents that sort of death spiral situation that we sort of tried to illustrate a little bit, and just makes a sort of setting the goalposts based on where institutions are currently. And then the second one would be establishing a separate funding source for exceeding targets. So this might be still having the institutional performance pools, but maybe a smaller pot of funding that would be able to be used to allocate for institutions that do go above 100% on their metrics. And so the next slide illustrates a little bit of how that would work. So if you set aside, say, $10 million, you'd still have the 20% for performance pools under the weighted student credit hour, but that $10 million pot could be allocated through a share of outcomes or relative growth methodology for only accessible to those institutions that exceed their 100% target. So again, that I think would at least put a little bit behind that issue of not being rewarded or not having incentive to reach for more than 100% of the target. All right, so you did ask us to look at other states that use these institution-specific pools. We identified two, so it is a pretty uncommon approach. North Carolina UNC system just 1 year ago, implemented this new approach where they have stretch goals that are individualized for each institution across all 5 metrics in their formula. And if you meet your stretch goal as an institution, your student credit hour gets weighted by an additional 3%. So it's almost the reverse. There's a little bit of a way it's a reverse of the way that the Nevada formula works, in that they would then add that factor on to the weighted student credit hour after meeting these metrics. But again, it doesn't sort of necessarily provide any reward for going above and beyond that stretch goal. In Montana, the institution's pools are defined by their share of FTE enrollment, so that is very much the way that the weighted student credit hour in Nevada works. It's based very much on your enrollment size, but they don't weight it for costs and program level. They have a growth target that's 1% above the prior year outcome, so they do sort of rebaseline it. But again, that sort of provides no reward for exceeding the target either. So we wanted to get you these examples. We can certainly provide a little bit more detail on each of them if that would be helpful. So the next section, talking a little bit differently from the funding formula itself, but you did ask us to look into funding for innovation in other states as well. We wanted to start by sort of noting that as we were discussing this, that innovation, as described by what we heard from the institutions and what we see in other states, can appear in a variety of ways, right? It's can be new investment to generate more economic development in the community. It can be research. It can be industry partnerships. It can also be things like a new approach to serving student parents or improving retention or outreach to make sure students finish their degree. So I think the definition of innovation is important for if this is something you all want to pursue. It'd be really important to be clear about what the goal of the innovation funding would be. The second point is that, the current funding formula does not prohibit, obviously, use of the funding for innovative practices. I think the limitation is probably that the total amount of funding, as we've heard from institutions, makes it hard to prioritize that. And so, even if there were something built into the funding formula that was based on innovation, right? A goal of getting funds into the hands of institutions for innovation. If the use of those funds is still available to fund instruction, student services, et cetera, those priorities are likely to crowd out innovation until sufficient funding reaches a level at which it makes it easier to set aside funds for innovation. So just building innovation into a funding formula does not necessarily mean that there will be more funding for innovation. It just means it will be allocated differently, right? We did not identify other states that have some version of this in their funding formulas. So we did find examples of states that fund it through other mechanisms, namely line item appropriations. I think Nevada has used enhancement funds for these sort of one-time purposes or strategic investments. But we see that in a number of ways. Florida has done some work to sort of create incentives for institutions to design. And Nate, maybe you should actually speak to this because you know this better. But I'll let you describe the Florida program.
Yeah, this was a while ago, and I think other states have done some version of this, but the state created a special fund, a pot of money that institutions could propose towards, and it had a couple of components. One was for faculty hire clusters that institutions could propose a topic area and submit proposals that a committee of the Board of Governors then reviewed and awarded. I can't remember the minimums and maximums. It was back in 2007 or 8 when I was working there. But it's the kind of thing that kind of by its nature doesn't lend itself to formula funding that much, as opposed to here's something new we want to do. We need some money to try something different where we don't necessarily know what the results will be.
Yeah, and there are a number of states, New Jersey being one, that sort of provided, a pot of funding for student success incentive funding grants. So similarly, institutions could propose ways that they would use some of that funding to improve their student success, retention, degree completion, et cetera. So just some examples of the ways that if Nevada wanted to, could pursue this. But I think, our recommendation would be focusing on sort of what is the goal of supporting innovation, what do you mean by innovation, and what would the goal of that funding be. So that brings us to the end of just, if you can go to the next wrap-up slide. So we'll try to sort of like sum it all up because we did cover quite a lot. We can go back to any slide you would like to, but so we started out by looking at defining priorities and goals. And so, Martha hit on the point of it's important to have that sort of both a state funding commitment and in particular a state goal or priority to align the metrics in your funding formulas to. What is it you're trying to achieve with this funding formula as a key step? We talked about enrollment being a key piece of a balanced funding formula approach. And so Nevada does not have something that is focused on the enrollment side. It's got the completion of a course, but could certainly consider looking at something like an FTE or headcount or headcount enrollment-based portion of a funding formula with weights by student characteristic. In OBF metrics, I think the sort of takeaway would be that Nevada's metrics are pretty solid, pretty common, pretty standard. They check all the right boxes. In terms of the metrics that are in the formula, you could consider things like transfer and progression as something to dig into further, but did not feel to us like something that was in dire need of addressing. But the implementation, that sort of institution-specific pool, would be something that we think would make sense to look at moving away from and moving towards one of those sort of 4 recommendations that we made on that particular issue. So with that, that wraps it up for us for today, and happy to have all of your questions.
All right. That is a lot of material to digest. One of the things that we have heard quite a bit about in presentations from the presidents relates to different attributes and how those would be measured. And that is part of your consideration and study, correct?
Martha Snyder, for the record, can I clarify by attributes? Are you talking institutional attributes or student attributes?
Both, actually.
Both. Yes, I mean, it is in many ways part of our, particularly the student attribute piece, but also looking at ensuring that the formula supports the particular institutional missions and variety of institutional missions.
And then I know we're focused on the funding formula, but also the performance pool, but one of the things that has bothered me about the way in which we're budgeting is the way we approach the budgeting itself. It seems backwards to me. It seems that it necessarily creates a problem for presidents, NSHE as a group of institutions to plan where they're not forecasting and looking forward, but rather looking or being based on old history that changes dramatically, especially in a state where you have funding in bienniums as opposed to annually. Is that part of the consideration, or do you have suggestions in that area?
Will Carroll. So something that was mentioned today was using a 3-year average instead of the sort of biennial checks, and that is a pretty common approach in a lot of funding formulas. Certainly something that we can weigh as part of the recommendations. I do think that there are none that come to mind that sort of try to forecast. So they all use backward-looking data because that's what's available and known. So I think it is going to be nearly impossible to prevent that entirely, but I do think it can be improved upon. Well,
suggestions in that area would be helpful, I think.
If I can just, maybe connect the two comments, I think perhaps considering within the O&M aspect, some of that considerations that have been mentioned previously, looking at some small school or enhancing the small school adjustment or reviewing that and making sure that is considering the various costs associated with being a small school, and particularly a small, very geographically broad institution, but also potentially including student attributes within the consideration of O&M. That provides that stability, but the kind of variability or the dynamicism or the dynamic nature of enrollments, weighted student credit hours, and completions is something that is most commonly reflected and addressed through 3-year averages.
Well, certainly going back to attributes, student attributes, so student support, part-time students, summer school students, students who aren't completing degrees, those seem to be more common in the community colleges, which is why I was wondering about a different formula for them as opposed to one for the degree institutions.
Martha Snyder, for the record. So certainly more common in the community colleges, and however, I would anticipate that the state would still expect and want to support those students receiving access to the state's public research institution. So ensuring that there's an incentive for the enrollment and completion of those students across the entire system.
Next steps for your firm, could you share those?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to make that part of my closing piece. But so We are concluding the remaining interviews with committee members and other stakeholders. We are going to be reviewing the institutional recommendations and then digging into some of the issues that you've mentioned. We already had sort of the summer credits on our list of data analysis to begin doing, but also wanted to hear from the committee in terms of any of these particular areas that we addressed today as to areas of interest for further analysis. But, do you want to add anything?
Anything further?
Chair?
Martha? Yes. Yes.
This is Chancellor Charlton in Las Vegas. I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you were moving on.
No,
but have
I
some
wasn't.
questions for
I
the
was going to
consultants. Okay.
invite member questions here in a minute. I just had a couple of additional items before I did that, and it was one final question from me. A common theme that we've heard from testimony, I saw in the president's input, the performance pool as configured doesn't work. Almost a universal advocation that it be abandoned entirely. I don't know that there are any substitutions that have been suggested, but what about that consideration? Eliminating a performance pool altogether and substituting it with something.
So I don't want to necessarily make a specific recommendation at this point. I think certainly considering how the performance pool, kind of to the end of Will's, Martha Snyder for the record, by the way, how the performance pool is implemented is something absolutely that we want to consider. And I think we have, we've put forward some recommendations on that. I think going back to the earlier part of our presentation, looking at a more comprehensive and cohesive funding formula that includes core costs, enrollments adjusted for student characteristics, outcomes adjusted for student characteristics, and some mission differentiation, and having that be kind of the crux of the funding formula rather than kind of a carve-out that distributes a certain portion of that funding formula is perhaps a way of looking at it and perhaps something for the committee to consider. So it's a more comprehensive funding formula that still reflects many of the components of the existing funding formula, but doesn't have that kind of pull out or carve out that I think is perhaps providing the most heartburn for institutions in terms of the way it's currently modeled and allocated.
Chancellor, I'm sorry, I was just asking some preliminary questions, but I invite comments and questions from the committee. Go ahead, Chancellor.
Great. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I just wasn't sure as you asked about next steps. I thought perhaps we were moving on. So I'd like to first see if there's any questions from the rest of the attendees here in Las Vegas before I jump in. Mr. Christensen.
For the record, Glenn Christensen, I actually just have 2 or 3 observations here. I was looking at the slide, I don't have a page number here, but slide entitled State Funding per Resident FTE versus Headcount for 2017 to 2018. 7?
It's slide 7.
Oh, I can't see that on mine.
Yeah.
At any rate, so I grouped the different types of institutions and took a look at those. For example, I looked at combining the Tier 1 research institutions with UNR and UNLV, and I noted on a FTE basis that UNR was getting roughly 12% more. On a headcount basis, it looked more like 23, 24%. And then I was looking at the kind of an average of the Great Basin and West Nevada and Truckee Meadows and compared that with CSN. And on a FTE basis, it's about 16% more than CSN. And on a headcount basis, it's about the same. Then I looked at Nevada State, and it's lower than both of those. I was curious if there's something in the current funding formula that will account for a difference between the northern Nevada schools versus the southern Nevada schools.
Will Carroll, my initial thought is that it is reflective of the weighted student credit hours, the weights, so the program mix at those institutions may be different in a way that leads to higher funding levels for I'm surprised that it aligns geographically, but it's something that we could look at more deeply. But program mix would be the main thing that I would think of.
It was just an observation.
Yeah.
When I'm looking at the principles of strong secondary finance system, which I thought were very good, there's 6 of them that are here. One of them, and again, I don't have a page number, but it says aligns states' current needs for a more educated and trained workforce. Thinking about the timing of our work, my guess is that there's going to be a lot of parties that want to have some influence on what those needs are for trained workforce and so forth. I don't know how that fits into exactly what we're doing. It does, but how do we, maybe this is more for the chair, how do we consider some of those things, assuming that we want to adopt these principles as part of our report?
So Martha Snyder, for the record, just reflecting on some considerations. Again, I think the performance pool metrics include some consideration of alignment or high demand degree areas. Certainly, potential reflection of how that gets measured. Are there areas of demand for the state? Are there areas of particular need for the state that you would want to incent completion of those types of degrees, or even establishment of expanded programs in those areas? I know nursing, I don't know if nursing is an issue in Nevada. I would anticipate it is, as it is nationally. Teachers are often one, and then certainly STEM, health, or other related industries are oftentimes incorporated. States oftentimes connect this or engage with their workforce development agency to understand what those needs are and include that, or at least incorporate in some way considerations of that in their funding model.
Yeah, Glenn Christensen for the record. I agree with you. I don't know that it belongs in the performance pool necessarily. It seems to me it's part of the overall, what I would call a base of the funding formula, but I'd be curious as to your thoughts on that as we go forward. As I mentioned, there were 6 principles of a strong post-secondary finance system. I'd like to add one, if we do adopt these principles, that include the perception of fairness. I think especially in this state, people put a lot of weight on is this a fair way to go about allocating the resources that we are contributing to our higher education system. Thank you.
Assemblywoman Mosca.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair, Assemblywoman Mosca, for the record. And I just wanted to give a comment. Thank you so much for this very comprehensive information. I really appreciate it. And for me, what's really just jumping out is that on that principles of a strong post-secondary finance system, it really says the first 2 things are to have clear goals and objectives, as well as it defined as an adequate level of resources. So for me, if I could understand that maybe the last plan had some goals, and that's why we had a performance pool, because it linked to the objectives and that helped us get to our objectives or metrics, then that makes sense to me. And I'm sure that the new plan is happening, and I just don't know, where that happens. But for me personally, I think it would be much easier to understand and give recommendations if I knew what was the aligned vision. So whatever I think need to do to get there, to me, seems like a next step. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. I'd like to first thank the consultants for this very, very comprehensive amount of information and data, and appreciate all the comparative that you've also provided. I have a couple of questions too, and going back to slide 7, and this is a question, this is the one that Member Christensen also referenced, the state funding per resident FTE versus headcount. In that specific slide, when you look at the funding per headcount and the funding per FTE, my question is just a little bit different. I noticed that TNCC, Nevada State, and CSN in particular actually are the 3 institutions that do not have any kind of enhancer to their current formula. For example, they don't have the small institution factor and they don't have research space. Is that also perhaps not just the mix of programs? Is that also perhaps a factor in that funding
Will Carroll for the
differential?
record. Yeah, I think that probably plays into it. Is we had the amount that the O&M research factor plays in. It provides between $150 or $300 per FTE, and we could find what the amount is per for the small institution factor as well. But that certainly plays a role.
And then also specifically probably for the community colleges in particular, while they don't have research in the same vein, they do have non-credit workforce programming that actually is a factor of their mission. I would call that your non-credit programs where they actually don't get weighted student credit hour funding for those. Are there any states that perhaps utilize something along those lines to either accommodate for the non-credit programs and even for the space similar to the research institutions?
Martha Snyder, for the record, something we can bring more information, more specific information about to our next meeting. But just a general comment is increasingly states are factoring in and considering non-credit within their funding formulas and how best to account for that. And again, we can bring some specific examples to that discussion for the next meeting in April.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to appreciate your summary comments about some of the factors that should be considered in the next funding formula recommendations, such as the core cost, consideration of the characteristics, the mission, and the institutional type. I think that will go a long way to really looking at what a fair and equitable funding formula might look like. I know we spent a lot of time on the performance pool, and I actually don't want to throw performance funding or performance out altogether. I think it's important for us to have goals that we've set for accomplishing degrees, transfer, supporting some of our populations. And I really appreciated all the detail that you provided about what was a successful performance pool. The problem that we have, though, is that our performance pool, while it's an outcomes-based, it actually doesn't drive institutional funding or even drive funding into NSHE as a whole for even consideration. It's basically that earning back. So appreciated that conversation and what the next set of recommendations might look like. I do have one question, though, is as you're looking at other funding formula in other states, one of the things I think you've heard, especially in the last meeting that we had, was that we have some inflationary costs that we have no way to introduce those into our formula. And I think everyone talks specifically about utilities, but there are other inflationary factors that do contribute. Is there anything that you have found as best practices to address those types of expenditures that are outside the control of the institution and that are not directly attributed to the actual delivery of instruction and completion?
This is Nate Johnson for the record. I'll try to address that in the sense that those are costs that institutions have to cover, and the formula is an allocation method. It can't produce money that the legislature doesn't award. So institutions either have to cover their costs out of their existing funds that they're using for something else, or out of tuition, or out of if they have access to other resources for research or auxiliaries or wherever the cost increases are happening. I have recommendations about how to think about inflation and which indexes to use and things like that, but that's getting into a level of detail you might not want right now.
Perhaps not right now, but hopefully we can add that to the list of things that we can consider as we move forward to shore up these recommendations. It is a real factor. So what's happening is that students are losing support services because we have to turn the lights on and we have to do these other kinds of factors. So just wanted to put that on the record. Any other questions in Las Vegas? Thank you.
Chair, if I could follow up on your
Chair
question.
Hardesty, no other questions here.
That's fine. Chair, I wanted to follow up on the Chancellor's question. are there institutions that collect those kinds of uncontrollable costs and fund them directly from the legislature with a COLA, for example? And is that something that could be considered? I don't know if our legislature's ever thought about that or discussed it, but certainly there's a lot of costs like this that the institutions can't control and we shouldn't be tying their performance and other outcomes to things like this. Do you know? Are there other institutions that are funded for those kinds of costs directly?
This is Nate Johnson for the record again. That's often a point of negotiation between a system or institutions and the legislature. If the legislature does not provide funding specifically for inflation-based costs, whether it's through a performance, increasing the performance fund formula enough to do that, or a special allocation, then of course, if an institution has an unavoidable utility increase, it has to pay that, and it may have to leave faculty lines unfilled, or there's some other place where that money has to come from, or they have to raise tuition if they have the discretion to do that. If they have a collective bargaining agreement with a COLA adjustment, that they've committed to in that, then they have to fund that before they fund things that they have more discretion over.
So maybe I could ask Mr. Combs this question because of his past experience with LCB, but state agencies would get roll-ups, at least that was my experience, for those kinds of costs. Is that not the case here?
I think what I would say, and I was just kind of whispering here to Heidi that, things like utilities, for instance, have been brought up a number of times where there's been a significant increase in utility costs in the state, and obviously there's nothing in the NSHE budget necessarily to address that. NSHE's not all that different from every other state agency in that regard. And it might be something that you'd want to consider on a more global thing in terms of talking to the legislature or the governor's office. They're the first ones responsible for putting it in the budget. Is if you address it for the state as a whole, I think NSHE would be treated just like every other state agency would in that regard. It'd be in a maintenance decision unit. There'd be an inflation factor that would be applied. It may or may not address everything, but it would hit NSHE the same way it would hit every other state agency in that same regard. So,
well, as we talk about base costs, base operation costs, perhaps that is something that would address the president's concerns and NSHE's concerns, and not have such a devastating impact on their educational efforts and goals and missions. Kyle, did you have a question or comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kyle Dalpy for the record. I did have a comment on the performance pool. Can I ask
Okay.
that now? Or you
Of
want
course,
to
yeah, no, go.
When we're talking, and what I've been talking about is the performance pool as part of our state appropriation. We earn that off weighted student credit hours. 20% is held over here. And I'm saying, and many of the other presidents have said, that needs to go away. But that funding that we would have get has to stay in the base because we live and breathe on the total funding that we earn the one time. Does that make sense? Because on the one slide where you've got the 20% and then the optional 10% carve out after as a performance pool, that's great to have money for a performance pool. But the adjusted general fund appropriation would be problematic because right now our budgets are built on the top line item. Does that make sense?
You're referring to the slide between, or the slide that came after the share of outcomes and the relative growth slides?
Correct.
Right. And so I think our view of a best practice for having any performance-based funding built into a formula is that it has to sort of be guaranteed from year to year. And if, without additional funding being provided to NSHE for this formula, it would have to come out of the sort of base, be set aside before that weighted student credit hour allocation. If there's, in order to be guaranteed from year to year, that sort of
Right, no,
base
I
recurring
get
is
that.
a-
Thank you for that clarification. And I'd like to just throw out there, I know we're not talking about new funding, but either way that 20% gets carved out would be a hardship on our top line budgets. And so that's down the road with recommendations, but I just wanted to note
Yeah.
it so it's on everybody's brain. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments from members of the committee in Carson City? Yes, Rick?
On the performance pool issue, obviously the new funding idea that's been thrown around a little bit, it seems to me that, the one, I guess, comparative state that you provided us that does that outside of the normal funding is Oklahoma that you had. I just wanted to make sure I understand, is that kind of the minority of the states do it that way? And I noticed they only carved out 2%. I'm kind of thinking that makes a little bit of sense, because if you're doing it outside of your base funding, you sure don't want to set it up so that you achieve those metrics. You get part of that 2%, and then the next year you don't get part of that 2%, then you can't use that 2% for ongoing costs, like creating new programs or expanding existing programs, because that funding's not ongoing. So obviously if you made it 20% or 15%, that would just grow exponentially year to year, and then you increase the chances that the legislature's not going to have the funds to fund that going forward as well. Is that, from your guys' experience, why you think most states have done something different than what Oklahoma has done?
Yes, and a lot of that comes, Martha Snyder for the record, from previous performance-based funding models which were funded outside of kind of the base funding allocation. They went away in difficult times. I think perhaps a way of looking at it, or perhaps a way of considering it, is considering adding or incorporating the metrics. I'm trying to think of this like after a long day. But that the way that the base is actually calculated, or what is being referred to as the base, which is currently only weighted student credit hours, that actually incorporates not just weighted student credit hours adjusted for student characteristics or student attributes, but also incorporates the outcomes that are currently carved out within the performance pool. So it's more of a formula that incorporates every element rather than carving out specific pieces of it to fund outcomes from what is currently being calculated as institutional's base. So it's more of a formula allocation that considers additional factors beyond the existing current weighted student credit hours, but as a way of also incorporating the outcomes that are currently reflected in the performance pool.
Any other
Chair,
questions?
this is Chancellor Charlton. Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Of course, sure.
So to that point, Martha, then I'm a little confused on the recommendation or the recommended areas for consideration where we move away from institution-specific pools. So you're saying to put all those in the base, which may cause an increased risk. If it's just all the base funding is determined on that, I would be a little concerned. And I think to follow up on some of the President's comments about some of the risks that might be associated, unless I'm misunderstanding that comment about putting those outcome factors within the formula themselves, but then we also move away from institution-specific pools where at least the institutions right now are not competing with each other to that, they compete with themselves. And so if what I'm hearing right is everything is put into that mix with all of those different measures. Is that what you're saying?
Effectively, yes. I mean, that is the way that states are increasingly approaching this. And yes, it does enhance or potentially enhance kind of competition, but it's a way of distributing state resources across a variety of factors that each institution can share in. So there are trade-offs regardless of kind of the allocation or the allocation approach that's being used. But yes, that is effectively, one of the considerations, or one of the possible considerations, is a formula that actually incorporates the outcomes within it for allocating resources across institutions, and you can build in different adjustments to minimize any kind of disruption in current funding.
Any further follow-up question? Oh, excuse me. Go ahead, Chancellor.
I'll have to reflect on it a little bit more and come back with some additional questions. My concern would be is, with such large factors, and we have some good indicators and metrics within the formula and the performance area right now, but we have such a large diverse population, and I think I really appreciated consideration of the weight for student characteristics. I think that would go a long way to supporting the needs of our students, but it's also going to have to drive the resources that support those students specifically. So I think I'll have to see what it all looks like as we tease this out.
Any other questions or comments from committee members for the HCM staff? All right, seeing none at this time, thank you, Ms. Snyder, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Carroll. We really appreciate your participation today, and we look forward to your ongoing work. We appreciate it very much. Thank you. With that, I'll close out agenda item number 6, and we'll move on to agenda item number 7, new business. I wanted to circle back to an item from the very first meeting we had back in November. At that time, there was some concern regarding our July meeting, which is scheduled for July 25th. We have not had any comment back since then, and the meeting will be our final work session. So I've asked staff to finalize that date for the development of our recommendations. That is critical because it'll leave very little time for the staff to complete the report if we don't hold the meeting on that date. Are there any members of the committee that, after looking at this schedule, have a problem or want to comment about that date? All right, I'm sorry, is there somebody raising their hand down there that I can't? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Senator Buck.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I will not be in attendance that day.
Okay. All right. The next couple of meetings obviously are very important to crystallize what we're going to do with regard to our recommendations. So I look forward to seeing you at those meetings. Several of the presidents expressed concern regarding the capital and deferred maintenance needs of their campuses. While our primary focus is the funding formula, I appreciate that infrastructure is critical to providing education and training opportunities for our students. As a result, I'm asking that the committee set aside some time on our May agenda to discuss those concerns and possible recommendations, understanding that our primary charge focuses on the NSHE funding formula. But I do want to air out some of the suggestions that have come out from the presidents in their letters, which I understand you haven't seen yet, but we'll get there, that deal with capital needs and those issues. Our next meeting will be held April 26th. That meeting will start at 9, not at 9:30, so please note that on your calendars. I had originally planned to attend the April meeting in Las Vegas, but have had to revise the plan because of the presentations and scheduling, so I'll be chairing that meeting from Carson City. And of course, the Chancellor will be running the show in Las Vegas. According to the work plan, the April agenda will include presentations again from HCM strategists, which will include additional information on modifications we may want to consider as we begin to develop the recommendations for the NSHE funding formula. and representatives for the Nevada Student Alliance will provide the students' perspective on the funding formula and any recommendations they may have to improve the NSHE funding formula. We'll also be reviewing the matrix that I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that is being developed and reviewed by HCM from the recommendations that were offered by the presidents in their letters to me and to staff. Are there other items that the committee would like to include on future agendas? Chancellor?
No, we just had a question down here, but it's okay. It's on the schedule, so.
Can I respond?
Ms. Williams?
What's the question?
Oh, we were just looking at the June date, the June meeting date.
Okay.
Ms. Williams?
No, I just wanted to circle back on the whole discussion we were having around workforce, and if we felt it would be of any benefit to us in hearing from Workforce Connections or an entity around workforce and training as it relates to better understanding those needs. And I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know, you know, if we should or not. I just wanted to just kind of circle back and make sure that we had that opportunity to weigh in on that.
What did you have in mind, Ms. Williams? You mean a presentation from companies or entities that are requesting workforce training? Is that what you mean? Or
No, from our agency, such as Workforce Connections or GoEd, and some of our agencies as it relates to education in our higher ed and in relationship to the needs from our business community and how that may play a role in the funding formula and the weights that we may give as it relates to those decisions. I don't know if it is a good idea to do or not. I just wanted to just kind of circle back to that since we've had a lot of discussions around workforce and high skilled, high demand.
So, Chair, this is Chancellor Charlton, and just to respond, so one of the groups that we do typically work with quite comprehensively would be the Governor's Office of Economic Development, specifically as it aligns with the priorities of the state in emerging job needs and or shortages in the labor pool. So that might be an entity, I think, if it's to make sure that our economic development or our workforce programs are aligned, just for consideration. And Mr. Christensen.
And Christensen, for the record, this was part of my observations earlier, but I'm wondering if how specific we want to get into some of these things. I agree that we should probably hear from workforce, but I'm not sure. It would seem to me that the governor's office and the legislature would want to weigh in on what those final weights ought to be, and I'm not sure that we're necessarily the group that should provide those. I'm struggling with how that would actually work. Maybe we suggest to them that this needs to be done, but not necessarily do it for them.
It'll definitely be part of the debate. I think we probably would end up offering some specific suggested weights, but all of that's going to be subject to later review by the governor and the legislature and the board too, frankly. But if we have enough data from our institutions and from the consultants, I think we might arrive at a recommendation, but I'm sure that whatever we recommend is going to be reviewed further by the governor and the legislature in any event.
Ms. Williams has a follow-up, please.
Yes.
Thank you, Yvette Williams, on the record. I just wanted to just express that it's my hope that we will at least have recommendations as it relates to weights and priorities, because again, from an equity standpoint, I would be concerned about what we value and that the recommendations we're making align to those values. And I would hope that that would be included in our recommendations. And I think weights go to express that. We may not come up with a recommendation of an amount, but maybe a priority or how it may, the weight it should have in comparison to others would be a concern of mine just from an equity standpoint. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that staff is attempting to do is to calculate the consequences of some of the recommendations to the extent that we have data to do so. And there are some recommendations made by the presidents for which there is no data. So I think quantifying, or at least having formulaic information to make some calculations will help, at least me, in assessing the impact of the recommended formulas. People need to take the formula and work through it, it seems to me, to be able to determine what it will do at their institution and how it will be influenced as against other institutions, just using the appropriations from 2023. So I think at least hopefully we'll be provided with some examples of or calculations using some of these weights, as well as obviously the quantification of those weights. We'll see. Any other comments from committee members? All right, then I'll go into agenda item number 8, which is the second opportunity for public comment for today's meeting. The process is the same as this morning. Public comment can be made in person at either meeting location. Additionally, those wishing to provide public comment telephonically may do so by calling 888-475-4499. At the prompt, please enter the meeting ID number, which is 873-8140-3793, and press pound. Before beginning your public comments, please state your name for the record and spell your last name. Also, member comment at this stage is also limited to 3 minutes per person. At this time, I'd like to invite those wishing to provide public comment in Carson City and Las Vegas to approach the witness table. Let's begin in Las Vegas. Is there anyone who wishes to make public comment in Las Vegas? Chancellor?
No, Chair, there is not. We've lost everyone here. Sorry.
Okay. All right, then public comment in Carson City. Mr. Irwin.
Good afternoon, Kent Irvin, ERVN, VIN, Nevada Faculty Alliance. I know it's late, but I have just a couple of points I want to about the discussion today. Regarding the charts on pages 5 to 7 that has been discussed, what's included in the numerators and denominators is important, and that's not clear to me. When we look at the main formula-funded budgets, per student FTE for just the 7 educational institutions, there's pretty close parity between the 2 comprehensive universities on the one hand and the 4 community colleges on the other. NSHE, of course, could provide accurate data. The committee and consultant, I believe, it would be helpful to have more education on how the state adjusted base budgets are created through the state budgeting process. And that's before the redistribution per the formula. Our understanding is that the weighted student credit hours are not used to calculate the total base budget. It's a distribution formula after the budget is set, not a funding formula. And that, I think, needs to be understood unless the goal is to change that process. And that would also need to be understood. Finally, one of NFA's missions is to advocate for shared governance. I would recommend that the consultants review faculty senate leaders at each campus, since there's only one faculty representative on the committee, and I don't believe there is a faculty presentation scheduled. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Any other comments in Carson City? Public comment. All right, seeing none, I'll invite those who might be on the telephone and want to offer public comment. Does the Legislative Council Bureau have anybody on the phone that would like to participate?
The public line is open and working. However, there are no callers at this time.
Very well. I'll close the public comments section. There being no further business to consider on today's agenda, I'll adjourn the meeting at 4:14. Thank you all very much for your participation today.